please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Hello and welcome to Money, 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 your weekly personal finance date with me, Surabhi Upadhyay. This week, we have stepped out of the studio to meet a very special guest. You know him as a stock market expert, you know him as a stock picker, you even know him as an author. But there's still more to this gentleman. He's done a lot of research, a lot of data mining on personal finance, and it seems that he knows how to get rich in a simple manner. Let's go meet him.
Hi, so very good to see you.
Thank you so much for having us over. It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Welcome to the Mukherjee residence.
I never thought this, because we keep talking stocks all the time. We discuss the Sensex, we discuss the Nifty. But today, money, money, money.
Okay.
I didn't even realize till now that you have a keen interest in personal finance.
So the hidden personal finance guru in me is about to emerge, and where better to give its first outing than on money, money, money.
Brilliant, brilliant. So I have plenty of questions.
Okay.
This promises to be...
Okay. Little apprehensive about the questions I have to concede because I'm sure they'll be well researched and searching.
Yeah, and trust me, because I will not be talking to you about the next sector that you like or what you're expecting in the Q4 earnings season or what the TCS earnings projections are going to be. So no.
Those are the easier questions to answer. So fair enough. I'm up for a proper grilling on personal finance. So fire away.
Okay. So Saurabh, first things first.
Yeah.
You're a geek, right?
Yes. I suppose if you write 3 books in 5 years, that moniker starts getting associated with you, but I would love to think I'm a little bit more rounded than that. You're right in saying that the common perception is that I'm a person who lives and breathes stocks.
I'll tell you why I'm saying that. Yes, I mean, it comes from years of interaction, because whether it's stocks, we discuss sectors, market as a whole, you always back it up with tons and tons of data. That shows through the writing. Is that how you've been right from school?
Yeah, so I think it started in my later teens. Till I think 14, 15, I was a perfectly normal child, playing a lot of cricket, spending most of my times outdoors. My parents migrated from India to the UK when I was 15. And it's obviously a difficult phase of life, as it is going through your teenage angst and you're adjusting to a new country. And I think in retrospect, I think the way I dealt with my adjustment was just sort of, pouring my mind, dedicating my mind to understanding the new country through books, through literature. And what it did was it took me to the LSE. It took me into the world of economics and finance. And
when did you know that you wanted to study finance? When did the bug bite?
I think finance came later. Economics came earlier. I think the reason economics came about was when I was 17 or 18. I remember I got my first job in the UK when I was 17. I was hired to work in a bathroom fitting store as a delivery boy. So I would deliver your bathtub and your bathroom fittings. And I used to remember going to people's houses, and I would look at the price tags of the things I was delivering. And I would ask myself that, look, I can see what this middle class guy in the suburb of London does, and how come he earns so much more than people in India. That's what dragged me into economics and to the LSE. Finance came later. Finance came a couple of years after I graduated from the LSE. I was working for a gentleman called John Kay. Probably the biggest influence in my life has been John. He used to have a firm called London Economics.
He used to teach at the LSE as well.
He used to teach at the LSE as well. And John took me to meet what was then the largest housing finance company in the UK called Halifax. It became a bank and then blew up in Lehman.
So what was the thought process there? Because those were very interesting times. I think this was, you can say the peak of, the previous bull run when everything you touched was turning to gold. How was it like being in London back then?
So interestingly, when I conceptualized my first startup, I was, I think, 25, 26 years old. I was traveling between India and the UK, and I could see that there was lots of talent in India, people who could analyze the British stock market. And the firm I conceptualized was one where the research would get done in India, actually very close to where I live now. And the clients we would cater to would be the British fund managers. And I went and persuaded John not just to become the chairman. John Kay also invested in the firm. And on the back of John Kay investing, a venture capitalist invested, and then a leading global investment bank said they would happily give us an execution platform. And then through 2004, 5, 6, 7, courtesy the bull run you're mentioning, we became profitable. Of course, we thought it was only because of our genius that we become profitable. But thankfully, again, in January 07, John and I were having a cup of tea, and and the thing about the great man is that he gives you ways to think about the world that nobody else does. And John took me down a path, and I remember to the day, 27 January 2007, I realized that the British financial system would blow up. So through 2007, we got all our clients, this is the British fund managers, we got them to sell their UK lending stocks, the UK banks.
What did you see?
So
a lot of other people didn't see that till a year later, and then we know what happened.
I have to confess, had it not been for John Kay, I wouldn't have seen it. What I saw, courtesy John's prompting, was that the British banks and housing finance companies, they were lending to each other more than they were lending to the public. So that the whole story began in 05, both in Britain and America. It was accelerating in 07, and I think it was partly because of my working with John Kay, we caught it early enough. And through 07, I remember all through the entirety of 07, we used to do conference after conference telling fund managers, get out whilst you can. And it felt a little scary because I thought, well, what if I'm wrong? I'll be making these people sell prematurely. But what reduced the stress levels for us was from 07 summer onwards, some of the European banks started blowing up, and that told us that our thesis was on the money. And as you know, March 08, Bear Stearns blew up. I migrated to India in May 08 after selling my firm in the UK.
Quite a fascinating story in itself. So 2008, 2018, 10 years of being here in India in finance, stock markets. What do you see? What have you noticed, learned?
Where India is a challenge is if you do what everybody else is doing and you're part of the same rat race, it does become very painful. So every now and then you have to think differently, you have to think out of the box and say, how do I create opportunities when everybody else just sees the same old well-trodden path? Can I go off the beaten path?
What made you sort of look at personal finance in a more holistic way, beyond just picking the next stock?
So I think the journey began when we were taking our home loan for buying the property in which we are having this discussion. So I remember sitting in the local bank branch waiting to sign my documents, and I'm a curious person, so I could see what was happening on the kiosks either side of me. People were being hard sold packaged financial products by so-called relationship managers at high street banks. And overhearing the pitches, I could see that it was little better than mis-selling. These people were being told that this is an equity product, but rest assured it's a guaranteed return. And that's when my mind started ticking about it. I then forgot about this strand of thought until I was put in charge of the wealth management business in Ambit a year or so ago. And again, I then encountered a group of clients who'd clearly been sold very expensive packaged financial products by prestigious financial institutions. And I told myself, it's not just a problem for the middle class. Even affluent people are being sold the wrong product at the wrong price, and hence and that's the trigger for coffee can investing.
And Saurabh is about to tell us a simple way of getting rich. Are you, Saurabh? Is there a shortcut to these things, perhaps?
I think the conventional view is everybody has to take a lot of risk to get rich in India. But my view has always been that the lower the risk you take, the more conservative your investments are. Provided you pick the right stocks and the right funds, you really have in India the unique combination, the low risk route to making stupendous amounts of money over a 10, 20, 30-year career.
That sounds too good to be true, And they say, is it even possible if something sounds too good to be true, does it even exist?
I think there are two parts to it. I think everybody, whenever I say these things and whenever I write these things, I get exactly the skepticism. There's two parts to it. One is you obviously have to pick the right stocks. The other part is keeping fees and expenses low. I think investing, everybody gets lost in this chase for the next multi-bagger. But if you keep your costs and your fees and your brokerage fees and your fund manager fees low, that's the other half of becoming stupendously rich. And if you can combine these two, you're well on your way to serious wealth.
Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of steps back now, since we are actually talking about regular middle class sort of, earner. The question that I always get asked as well is that, how much to set aside?
Sure.
There is definitely the inflation factor that you have to consider.
Absolutely.
But sometimes you wonder, these numbers that are thrown at you, X crore, X, Y, Z crores that you need to have in your bank, are the calculations correct? Whom to believe? How to really set aside the goal?
So there are two parts to planning your goal. One is just to hedge inflation. You need returns of 9-10% just to deal with inflation. Over and above that, if you're saving for your children's education, you're saving for retirement, you're saving for, say, a holiday home in Goa, you're looking at an extra over and above the rate of inflation. So if 10%, 9-10% is pre-tax is what you need to deal with inflation, typically most people need somewhere around 15 to 17% over 20-30 years to save for broader goals beyond just hedging inflation.
But for the average Joe who's thinking fixed deposits, mutual funds, now of course a lot of Indians through SIPs are in that side of the investment sort of arena, where will you achieve that 15 to 17%?
For most people, if they're able to take say 100 rupees of their wealth, I think there's sort of an 80-20 demarcation. 80 rupees equities, 20 rupees as a rainy day asset, which goes into liquid funds and bond funds. You want to keep your rainy day asset very liquid, very safe. The 80 rupees that you put into equities, I would say there's three buckets to it. One, I would begin by saying something which sounds very counterintuitive, but I think has made a lot of sense for me, is a tracker fund. Put your out of 100 rupees, put 30 rupees in a high quality Nifty tracker fund, which charges you say 0.1% and diligently tracks the Nifty.
So an ETF, simple ETF,
absolutely,
which doesn't cost too much.
And there are several houses in India which offer ETFs. Log on online, buy your ETF. You probably have to open a demat account, but it's not that big a deal. So buy yourself an ETF for 30 rupees of your money. With the next 30 rupees, what you need is a blue chip stock portfolio, high quality stock portfolio. Third, 20 rupees out of 100, I would say find a small cap mutual fund. The good news in India is there are several small cap mutual fund managers who have consistently delivered super returns, right? And we are blessed as a country, both in PMS and in mutual fund. We've got talented small cap managers. So 30 rupees tracker, 30 rupees coffee can, 20 rupees in a small cap mutual fund, and the final 20 rupees your rainy day corpus, government bonds and liquid funds.
This is really interesting because nowhere in this do I hear assets like real estate, or gold.
Yeah.
I don't think you have much love lost for real estate, right? Which traditionally has seen Indians.
I think, as you said earlier in the program, I'm a numbers-driven geek. So, for example, the suburb of Bombay we are standing in, most of these flats around us are $1 million plus, right? And that to me is a little, surreal. The rental yields on these flats are 2%. The cost of buying taking a home loan in India is 8.5%. If you have that sort of mismatch, it's telling you that these flats in India or in Mumbai are overvalued, right? To put it in a perspective, my parents in the suburbs of London, their house in the suburbs of London is cheaper than my flat in the suburbs of Bombay. And I think we can take a broad guess as to which city has more money. So I think residential real estate in India has got mispriced. If you buy a flat to live in, it's one thing. But you've got to be clear that it's not going to make you a great deal of money over the next 10 years. If you take countries like USA, take countries like UK, Australia, over the last 100 years, in the heydays of the West, real estate has given anywhere between 0.5% to 1.5% per annum, right? If real estate hasn't worked as an asset elsewhere in the world over long periods of time, it's unlikely in India we'll reinvent the wheel and give tremendous returns from real estate over long periods of time. 03 to 13, we had a tremendous run. A lot of black money, as I say in the book, went into real estate. I think that era of black money fueling real estate prices are broadly behind us. Savings are swinging into the financial system and they're coming into assets like mutual funds and coffee can portfolios. And hence, in a way, the context of modern day savings has to focus on financial rather than physical.
Now, before we end this part of the conversation, I'm going to come back to mutual funds. And you made some points there earlier about, who gets commissions where and what's happening. We discussed why maybe exchange traded funds like a Nifty fund might be a smarter idea. How should one build their mutual fund portfolio aside of the stock portfolio, which we'll discuss in a bit?
Out of say the 100 large cap equity mutual funds we have in India, all the data suggests that no more than 4 or 5% of them have any ability to generate consistent alpha. That means 95-96% of our large cap mutual funds have a pretty patchy track record of alpha generation, and yet they're taking away 2% from you every year. Which is why my point is on large cap mutual funds, rather than buying beyond this 4 or 5 very elite select fund managers, you're better off buying an ETF, right? In small cap mutual funds, on the other hand, I think there's at least half a dozen funds who are regularly, year after year over the last 10 years, beating the indices. And whilst they charge 2.5%, they're giving you your money's worth.
One final point on commissions, because the model is really evolving, and I think a lot of investors still don't know whether it's a distribution model they're following, whether there's a trail commission sort of element to it. In your experience and what you see around the industry, if one is willing to pay the price for fair advice and get away from this distribution commission model, then what is a reasonable price to pay for advice, and what is the industry parlance?
I think the good news is because of the regulated investment advisor construct that SEBI is trying to come up with, there is a growing group of advisors who are paid by the customer vis-a-vis fees. And by and large, the number that's doing the rounds is the RIA is taking 1%, is taking 1% of your portfolio as fees. But the comfort you have is that 1% is transparent, and the RIA's interests are aligned to your outcomes.
And sort of it is stocks that now we talk of, because you know what, I think as we're talking about this affluent Indian who's now already a little sensitized towards mutual funds in the world of equities, I think people are realizing that 25 lakhs, which is a threshold for a PMS, is not a sum that's completely out of reach. It's there within households.
Right.
So people are wondering how to take the right steps.
Right.
So how do you begin?
I think, look, I mean, the first thing to realize about stock selection, whether a PMS fund manager does it for you, or a mutual fund manager does it for you, or you do it for yourself. I think if you keep it simple, it's actually the most effective. The more you complicate stock selection and make it about PE multiples and complicated stories, the less likely you're to make money. And the simplest way I have found is find a metric which captures growth. I've taken revenue growth, the simplest metric, and find a metric which captures the moat, the comparative advantage around the company. And ROCE, return on capital employed, typically has been my metric. And therefore, at its simplest, if you look at the last 10 years, preceding 10 years, look for companies who've grown revenues at 10%, ROCE of 15%. You'll typically find 15, 16 such stocks in India. You combine them into a portfolio. You get around 10x in 10 years with this sort of strategy. You know,
again, it sounds so simplistic that you wonder, is it really going to work? Because there are only two filters. You sit on these stocks for 10 years. My question is this, 10 years is a long enough span of time. What if things change, and things do change? The industry might change. There might be a completely different competitive sort of angle to things. There might be a technological change. So maybe the line of work that the company is in, some of those lines might just become obsolete. So how does the coffee can protect against all of that?
The crux of picking a great company is you don't have to then second guess how will they deal with change. Because remember, if you do have to second guess, neither you nor I nor any analyst out there can actually second guess it. So the less you second guess and the more you focus on the quality of the franchise and the management, the more likely you're to make money. So absolutely, change is a constant. Choose the companies who've shown the greatest ability to deal with change. And on balance, what the data shows is going forward, they'll deliver for you.
In the book, you also argue that perhaps, this timing and the price doesn't really matter if you're in these kind of companies where you have conviction. However, when I do hear you talk about the market as a whole, obviously valuations are a concern. I mean, you do talk about how even now we seem to be in overvalued zones.
Absolutely.
So how do the two sort of correlate?
It's a very, very nice paper. So look, I mean, if you don't buy quality in India, right? And when you're buying the market as a whole, obviously you're buying a lot of mediocre stuff as well. If you don't buy quality in India, if you're buying the market as a whole or generally buying low quality stocks, you have to buy it cheap, right? Because if you're buying mediocre stuff, obviously it's going to be cheap. But all the data out there, every shred of data that I've seen in my 10 years in India suggests that if you're investing in high quality companies, then the entry period does not matter, provided you stay patient for at least 3 years. If you're going to be going in and out, if you don't have patience, then again buying cheap makes sense. If you're buying low quality, buying cheap makes sense.
Before I come down to the last bit of our conversation, your tip to those who are looking to go direct in stocks, regular middle class people who are willing to go beyond mutual funds now and are willing to go direct.
I think I'll reiterate what I've been saying. Buy high quality names, put them away in some sort of safe bucket, safe that you can't touch whenever you feel like it, and open that bucket, open that box 10 years from now. Unless I'm mistaken about India's future and the stocks' future, you would have made a lot of money.
That sounds good. Well, on that note, we're going to end with a couple of rapid fire questions as always. So this is the tricky part. Can't think. It has to be, snappy and quick. So where does Saurabh Mukherjee park most of his own money in terms of asset classes, stocks or whatever? Where's your own money?
In all seriousness, in the coffee can portfolio. It is there.
Okay, all right. So that's saying something. You're a stock picker and it's been 10 years of looking at the market. What about the worst decision perhaps? Investment, pick,
I think the call that went wrong for us was the post-demonetization aftermath. We rightly said that the economy would slow down. It did. But what I think I misjudged specifically, I think I got to take the rap for this, is I didn't realize that when people take the money out of the mattress and stick it into the financial system, both bond and stock prices would roar through. In retrospect, I feel a little stupid at not having figured that out. So we got the economy right, we got the stock market wrong last year. Hopefully we're not going to repeat the same mistake this year.
Okay, fair enough. Some of the best fund managers that you like here in India?
I think in Gurus of Chaos, the fund managers who are in Gurus of Chaos are Shankar and Naren, has been an absolute star for a long time. Akash Prakash at Amansa in Singapore has been a tremendous fund manager. K.N. Sivasubramaniam used to work in Templeton and he retired 5 years ago. I think was an absolute star. And all of these legends, not only are they great fund managers, I think they're also guiding lights, the beacons for the next generation. People like me who only found our way through the Indian market over the last 10 years. We've benefited from having exemplars like this.
Someone or something that really inspires you?
I think Rahul Dravid, he's retired, but even as a coach, he continues to inspire as coach of the India Under-19 team. I think he exemplifies a lot of what all of us would like to see, humility, talent, achievement, and yet all of that in the context of very middle-class values.
Oh, fantastic. So you do like cricket. Do you watch the IPL as well?
I watch it because it's good entertainment, but...
which team do you support? Because you stayed in Delhi while growing up, but you're Bengali, so which team? Look, and now you're in Mumbai.
All the people at home are Mumbai Indians fans. I won't reveal my support base. I think when you see me in the MI Stadium, watch my t-shirt.
Okay, fair enough. If you weren't picking stocks in the stock market, what would you be doing?
I'd probably be a writer, I have to confess. So I think all of us grow up reading extensively. So probably would be writing something, ideally fiction. But hey, writing non-fiction is not a bad idea.
And finally, what have these last 10 years of being in the stock market, being in the world of finance, taught you, a lesson that you perhaps hold close to your heart?
I think whatever happened yesterday, forget about it. Wake up tomorrow morning, start every day afresh.
I think that's a fantastic note to end this on. Saurabh, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
a lot of insights there for our viewers to take away. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it on this week's edition of Money, Money, Money. Do send us your feedback, your comments, your queries. We'll see you again next week.